topic of the webinar today is around smarter speed training. We're going to dive into some stuff specifically around contrast training, managing that with volume, which I know is a topic that both these guys are really passionate about. But before we get into it, part of the reason that we decided to have Brian, you on specifically is because we've got our Speed Lab Summit coming up, and you're going to be one of the speakers there. And so we're doing kind of a webinar series with different speakers that we're going to have out at the summit so that people who may not have heard from them before can kind of get a feel for who they are, their approach, and then hopefully think about coming out to our summit, joining the Speed Lab community and learning a little bit more there. But Tony, I know that obviously you were a speaker at our summit last year. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit from you because I know you do a ton of these events. I'd love to hear a little bit about like your biggest takeaways from last year's summit.
Well, I think the most unique thing is the community aspect, the like instant camaraderie that happens, and something that Drew Zwire said to me maybe 4 years ago really popped into my head. And I was talking about how Feed the Cat, some people say it's like a cult, and Drew said that every business should strive to have a cult-like following. And I thought, hell yeah, that's what it's like. And so when I say it was kind of like a cult, I really mean it in the best terms, where people were just really felt like they were a part of something bigger than themselves. And that's, I think, exactly what you want. And I think that, that like our track football consortium does a pretty good job with that. But I think the USR community is even better.
Yeah, 100. The joke is we're putting the cult in culture, right? But no, I love that you said that because the community really is. When I talk with people about the Speed Lab partnership, there's the software component of what we do, there's the education component, but really the vision was started with the community, right? Like, how do we just get coaches who are passionate about speed and passionate about making a good living here on the same page? 1 second. Sorry, guys, I forgot to lock my door, and then my daughter got home and walked right in here. Pleasures of working from home. Apologies. But yeah, Tony, I love that you said that. And Brian, maybe if you could tee up a little bit some of the stuff that you're excited about with the summit coming up and some of the stuff that you want to hit on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I fall similar in line with what Tony said of, relationships are such an important component to coaching in general. And, we often get lost in the weeds of programming. And, at the end of the day, I had a conversation with a coach the other day. We're all kind of doing some of the same stuff, and I think it's really important. It helped my career for sure to be in community with other coaches that were better than I was, that I looked up to, and to be able to absorb those things. And, those organic conversations that happen at clinics, at seminars and things like that, summits are, I think they're gold, especially for young coaches that are trying to learn and grow. And then even for us old guys that, I'm still learning stuff. I'm learning stuff in the last month that has completely changed how I'm looking at things. And, Tony and I's relationship kicked off from, being in community and having a relationship and idea sharing. And I think just having that, growth mentality is what getting together and sharing what we're doing is all about. It's such a dog eat dog kind of community, in speed training and in the performance world. And I really wish it wasn't like that, because there's so much knowledge out there to absorb and work off of. So just super excited to kind of get around other people. I'm always excited to go learn something new myself. Obviously, love sharing what we're doing and seeing if that can help somebody, change a little bit of how they look at things. So really excited for it.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're really excited too. And Brian, I know we're excited to have you out. So yeah, enough there. We'll get into the topic of today. Again, thanks everybody for jumping on. And Brian, I'll actually let you kick us off because I know we kind of built this topic from a conversation that we were having with you about what you're thinking about and what you're interested in right now. And you brought up that you've been really focused on contrast training. And so maybe let's just start there, because when I heard that term, I'll be transparent, it was a little bit of a novel term to me. And so maybe just start by talking a little bit about what contrast training is and how you define that.
Sure. Contrast training to me, I've probably been dabbling in it since the late 90s. I think it's something now that there's terms to it. We got fancy equipment and all the things that we can, put in and around it. And it's been, redefined. I've redefined it of how I'm using it. And devices like the 1080 obviously make things, really easy to implement it now. But I mean, basically, we're just adding resistance to different movements to enhance, neuromuscular performance and improve speed. And in 1996, 97, when I started my coaching career, we were running up hills, we were pulling sleds, we were, adding bands to things, to add some sort of a load. I didn't know what a PAP effect was, in 1997. Looking back, I think there's, anecdotally, we had things going in the right direction for a long time. Now we've just been able to define it a little better. And so, for us, that's what contrast training is. It can be implemented in all phases of our training. We put it into our, all of our movement work with acceleration, max velocity, change of direction. We also use it in the weight room, where we can get additional, muscular adaptations through it. And so, the French contrast has been around for, since before I was born. And so just taking some of those concepts and ironing them into our template of how we, train. I guess now the catchphrase is contrast training. So that's kind of how I define it.
Got it.
Now, Brian,
Go ahead, Tony.
would you, I remember the first time that we were together one-on-one over a beer. I asked you, I couldn't stay long. I said, give me one thing that it is just a must in the weight room. And you talked about the concentric deadlift supersetted with a plyometric and then a 5-minute recovery. That is an example of contrast training as well, isn't it?
100%. Yeah, that is defining contrast training, right? Like we're putting a load on the body and then we're going to do a similar movement with similar, muscular activation and do it without load. And we get that PAP effect, which is the post-activation potentiation. So we load the system. And then when we unload the system, we get a little bit more of a powerful movement and explosive movement on the back end of it. So, at the end of the day, what we're all chasing is high output. And how do you get higher output is to, activate it through a load and then, implement the same movement without the load.
It was interesting. You said that you started around 96. I think it was in 96 that I went to a clinic at the University of Illinois, and there was a S&C guy that was talking about how they worked with volleyball kids and they would do squats and then they would superset it with box jumps. And they said that they had like 3 test groups. One was squat only, one was box jumps only, and one was this contrast thing. And that the contrast group improved their vertical jump by 3 inches more than the other 2 groups. So it wasn't just the squat and it wasn't just the box jump. It was that beautiful combination, that contrast that created the difference. And to me, that really made sense. And so when I went back to our pole barn that served as a weight room at a small school, we simply did jumps after squats. And that was our very primitive way of doing contrast training.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these things, it's funny, right? We stand back, we think we got something, but really it's like because of a time constraint. So you did one exercise and you clustered it with another 2 or 3 exercises because you were just trying to save time. I did a lot of large group training when I first started coaching, and well, let's pair something with this so that we can kind of keep kids moving throughout the weight room or throughout the performance center, and you kind of stumble onto these things that you find work. And then it's almost like you've reverse engineered it because you're doing those things just to make it work for the athletes. And then you look at the highest level athletes in the world, the Eastern Europeans and the Russians, they were doing this stuff back in the 70s, before, I guess maybe before we were, had even thought about doing it. So yeah, definitely been around a long time.
And would you also say that simply doing a resisted sprint followed by a sprint, that's contrast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, you're also accomplishing, on the force velocity profile, you're accomplishing strength and speed in the same session, which again, if we all had a perfect world and we had an athlete for, 6 days a week and, all the recovery that we wanted, that'd be great. But none of us have that, right? I mean, even the highest level athletes, you still have challenges of time. And so to be able to accomplish both of those things is unbelievable.
How does the 1080 facilitate your contrast training?
So the 1080 has just made things a lot easier. I mean, I would tell you, for years and years in our fall programming for track, we use like a sled. We would do a sled pull for a contrast. We'd run 30 meters with about a 10% load on their body weight for 30 meters. We'd do that twice, and then we would unload and do it, without weight. And we would usually time that rep. Again, I've been timing stuff for a long time. Tony comes along, rank, record, publish. I'm like, man, this guy's a brother from another mother. But that was kind of the contrast. Well, now what we have on the 1080s, we can actually run a load profile on them. We can find the exact amount of load that we want. When you're training 50 high school kids, it's hard to find the exact load. You're guessing, and I'm not sure that 1, 2, 3, 4% is going to make that big of a difference, especially in a, like a young developing athlete. But when you're working with an elite level athlete, those percentages make a difference. And so the 1080 allows us to dial it in to within, a half a pound, and keeps it exactly consistent. I mean, how smooth the equipment is unreal, compared to, hey coach, the sled broke over here, and, homeboy went down on his face, or whatever. It's like, now we have this elite piece of equipment that can do the exact same thing we've been doing, just safer, more accurate. I think we're probably going to see better results because of that.
Real quick, Tony, just before you jump in, because I don't want to kill the flow. I love this. But just to the audience, if you guys have questions, please start dropping them in the Q&A, and we'll try to tackle as many of them as possible. But Tony, go ahead. Did you have something else you wanted to add there?
No, I was just, my brain was thinking back to two things that I've done, and probably Brian has done too. It's almost laughable now. If you don't have some cringy things in your past, then you haven't evolved much. And I just remember 25 years ago contrasting with running with a parachute followed by a bungee cord. And both things are like laughable now, but those were my high tech things. And in a way, I was thinking, right, like, okay, resistance with the parachute, and now overspeed with the bungee cord. Yeah, it's just we don't do that. Were you a parachute guy ever?
Absolutely. I mean, anything you get your hands on, to add resistance, and then, to come back and figure out resistance. I used to drive all over Denver to find the perfect hill that would land at about 3% grade, to do some downhill running. And I'd drive my kids, 20 miles to go find that perfect hill. I feel like guys like you and I should be getting some kind of royalties from 1080 for, what they're doing now. Of all the, dumb stuff that we tried, but I think we were on the right track. We just didn't have access. I didn't have resources. We didn't have the knowledge. The equipment wasn't there. And, a lot of the high level athletes were using parachutes and bungee cords, so it's not like we were, complete head in the sand. We were on the right track,
Yeah, you guys should get some R&D dollars for figuring out exactly the right amount of resistance for 1080. Yeah. So Brian, I was going to ask, is this something that's relatively new to you in terms of you incorporating that? It sounds like it's something that you've been incorporating maybe unintentionally for a long time, but in terms of intentionally trying to incorporate it, is that relatively new for you, or is this something you've been doing for a long time?
The newness is the technology, the technology and equipment. I would say implementing contrast training, and goes way back for me. I was privileged to be able to kind of watch and learn from a coach named Tony Wells, who was probably the best track coach nobody's ever heard of. He was kind of a youth coach here in the Denver area. And when I'd go up and watch his practices, he was a big two loaded reps by one unloaded rep in almost everything he did. And he implemented weight vests and, plyometrics and depth jumps, and his weight room was very similar. And I took that concept and ran with that from a very young age. I didn't come by like my system or how we train athletes more than just watching coaches and then trying to replicate it, and asking a lot of questions of why that would, and then you start to see how it changes things. And over time, right, those aren't things that just change, in a session or even a week, but over the course of time, those higher outputs on a daily basis that you're getting from, almost a temporary increase in your muscle's ability to generate force because you're adding a load. Then when you take that load away, you really can roll, and you might hit PR speeds or get into the higher end of output that you may not have gotten to otherwise. And that's what we're always chasing, right? I mean, Tony says it with his stuff, like, any fool can make another fool tired by running. We don't get a lot of accomplishment out of just repping through, at anything less than almost 100% output when we're in that energy system. So it just creates higher outputs for us, and that's what we've been after for a long time. Yeah, I don't know if it's new. It's just now it's just a lot easier.
You mentioned the PAP, or I just say potentiation.
Yep.
Potentiation is an okay word to use, but I think it's important. I go back to that guy almost 30 years ago that said that when you squat and then jump, the collective effect is greater than the sum of the parts. That there's some magic in the contrast, and that potentiation is where one thing makes another thing better.
Yep.
And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, there's the output, there's the energy systems that I think it enhances. It also, for me, with some of the resisted stuff that we'll do, I like it because it slows the movement down enough to be able to coach the technical model side of it. Right. And I don't know if that's something that gets talked about a lot, but when you're really focused on the technical model of how the ground interacts, the foot interacts with the ground, where their positions are in extension and flexion, then it's hard to see that sometimes at really high speeds. So if a kid's just running full speed, you might have to take it and videotape it and break it down. But if you put a load on them, it slows things down enough that it highlights where they're deficient. And then you can come back and coach that. And so for a long time, I've used a resisted sprint of just being able to help coach the technical model.
Love it. Okay, cool. We're getting some good questions pouring into the chat here. And I was going to actually ask Brian, you to speak a little bit on just how this relates to volume, right? But I actually think it's probably some of that's going to come up in some of the questions we got coming in the chat here.
That was actually going to be my next question, so I will ask this.
Okay, go ahead, John.
I think I know the answers to this, but the volumes, not only should we strive to keep the volumes fairly low, they need to be low. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You guys need to be somewhat fresh
Absolutely.
So this is not like we're going to get these guys in shape type of stuff.
No, I mean, it falls within that speed priority, mentality of, finding the minimum effective dose where we can, get the right stimulus provided, but without presenting fatigue. And so when you add resistance, there is an element of that's harder, right? There does take more output. And so there might have to be additional rest, and you do have to consider total volume. And sometimes, I mean, it's as simple as, we're going to hit two 0 to 30 accelerations at 10% body weight, and then hit one with unloaded. That's only 3 total reps. But if they're done right and there's enough rest and recovery, you're going to, move the needle for the output.
And you wouldn't do that like 12 times.
No. Total volume, we'd probably be under 6 reps total between loaded and unloaded reps. And that's going to be with, 2 to 2.5, 3 minutes recovery between each. So that's a session right there, right? That's 25, 30 minutes of actual, sprinting, maybe not quite that long, maybe 20 minutes. But by the time you've ramped up and done all your drill work and then, tag that on, you could be 40 minutes of a speed session.
Awesome. Okay, cool. I think that ties in well to the first question from the Q&A here from Eddie. Eddie asks, how long of a recovery between movements are you giving?
For me, I try to operate on about a second per 10 meters is a good kind of place to be. I think you need a good solid minute and a half after even a short 20-meter sprint, to recover. Now, full recovery, if you want, complete ATP replenishment, you're looking at about 4 to 5 minutes. I think at times, in a perfect world, if you have an elite pro athlete, you can maybe do that. But with kids and groups and teams, it's hard to, justify a full recovery like that. So I think minimum would be about, 1 second per 10, a minute to minute and a half, after about a 20, 30 meter run.
And I would bet that you probably don't have like a stopwatch counting that. I think coaches kind of know it. It goes back to the Supreme Court justice that said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Like we know recovery when we see it, or we know that a guy is not ready to do that next rep when we see it. So sometimes I just say the recovery needs to be enough.
Yeah. And I mean, I think too, one of the hardest things that we do as coaches in the high performance realm is to try to gauge neural fatigue, right? It's pretty easy to see when somebody's gassed because they're out of air or they, muscular fatigue in the weight room, but neural fatigue's a whole nother monster, right? You can't see or touch or feel that, so it's really, we have to go on the science of how long we think that's going to take to recover and know that if we go beyond, I mean, we'll run flag 10s. Tony, I'm sure you see this. I mean, have you ever had a kid on his fourth rep of a flag 10 run faster than they did in the first 2 reps? I think it's pretty rare because their nervous system, they might look good, they might start to feel a little bit better, muscular, wise, if they didn't warm up well enough, but neurally they're fatigued and they're tired, and they can't have that same high output or turnover. So we say that a lot, where their fourth, fifth reps are starting to decline, and that's about the time we pull the plug.
Yeah, usually I have like one freak out of my team that doesn't run as fast as till the fifth one. And we always, I mean, the kid always gets probably a little bit tired of me talking about this, but I always say, what does that tell you about your warm up before your race? Like, you don't want your race to be a part of your warm up. So
Right.
you, more than anybody, needs more sprinting before you sprint.
Sure. And right, everybody's a little bit different, right? There's no cookie cutter pattern for every kid. And, there's outliers, right? There's kids that just, you have I remember I had a kid in the 800 meters show up for a race about 3 minutes before they walked to the starting line. He was late from a swim meet, and he showed up and stepped on the track and won a conference championship in the 800 meters without a warm up at all. And it took every speech that I'd given on proper warm up and just flushed it down the toilet, to all the other kids. But he was an outlier, he was kind of a freak, and you find that all the time. So we try to operate on the norm of what most kids, most athletes are going to experience.
Sweet. Awesome. All right. The next question here is from Mel. First off, she said, thanks for the collaboration. But then she's asked if you guys are doing contrast training most days, and if not, how you would split the sessions in a week.
Tony, you want to go, or you want me to take that?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, we probably have a sprinkle of it in most sessions, especially in the early training phases. So, we kind of split our days up into 3, components of acceleration, max velocity, and change of direction. And typically we are finding ways to contrast within all of those systems. Now, it's not a lot. It might be as simple as a change of direction day. We might do like call it a lateral banded, fast feet, back and forth fast feet, and then unload and do the same thing. We're just kind of potentiating the system for what the high output might be for the day. And so I do think we've found ways to try to implement some level of contrast training. And in the weight room, I'd say we contrast every time we're in the weight room at some level in some block of the weight room.
Yeah, we'd be the same way. In our speed drills, we like for our 10th and final speed drill to be an acceleration, and we'll just have bands out, or we'll do partner resisted stuff, and we'll do one of those, and then we'll do an unresisted sprint. So I guess in that way, on speed days, we could do it. And I was just thinking in my head that a lot of my guys lift during the day, and it's not exactly contrast training where you go from a lift to a jump, or from a resisted to a total sprint. But in a way, like I always say, the worst thing you could ever do is to lift and never sprint. It's just, you're just not getting the rest of the package if you're doing that. And sadly, so many football teams, as you know, they lift only, and then they just go out and do a lot of conditioning and a lot of football stuff. And so they're never getting that full recruitment of muscle fibers, that on and off frequency that's so important. And yeah, so in a way, we're kind of contrasting anytime we have a focus on strength and sprint.
Sure. Yep. I just think it's a way to be really efficient with your time, and efficient with your outputs. And again, you can kind of check the box on strength work and speed work in a same session, which is gold, because we never get enough time with the athletes.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Tony, I think the next two, I would like to start with you. I think they'll be good ones for you. The next question was, what is the best drills for acceleration training for kids with only turf and a few cones? How can you get load? Tony, this just felt like it was a question made for you, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when I post stuff like partner resisted stuff where you just put your hands on a guy's shoulders and they come out and you give way and then let them go. Or we have the thick bands and you know people are like, hey coach, there's sleds for that kind of thing, you know, and I'm like, yeah, there is, but I'm also coaching 35 kids and sleds are not very efficient with that many kids. So yeah, anything that can add resistance without taking a lot of time. Now, if I was working with one or two athletes, like I know Chris Corfus does a lot, I know Brian does a lot at his facility, a lot of those things would be different.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think like I think about like isometrics, you know, like an isometric push into a wall or some kind of single leg isometric hold into sprinting or into, I mean, there's ways to load the system without having to have fancy equipment or, you know, you could just do it on a field, honestly.
Explain that idea of isometric to a sprint.
Yeah, so I mean, you could load like into if you like you're in your gym at your indoor track, you know, you could go to the wall and load up into a you know an A position on the wall and hold that almost like a car push. I call it a car push ISO. So you're loading in, you got the foot dorsiflex, you know, negative shin angle, and you're pushing hard, right? Almost to the point of you know you're shaking. There's some fast twitch muscle recruitment in an isometric hold, and you could hold that for 15 to 20 seconds and then get a short recovery of 30 seconds and then do an acceleration. So you've just now done some level of contrast training without having to have a band or a partner or a 1080 or, you know, any of those things. And again, you know, going back to the late 90s, you know, we were doing some of those creative things and getting similar results. So to whoever asked that question, you know, creativity is your only limiting factor.
Love it. Okay, cool. And Tony, the next one feels right up your alley as well. And Brian, of course, feel free to jump in on these. I just know like I'm reading this question. I'm like, that's made for Tony. Gabby asked, can you say something about how speed training has a generally beneficial impact on total CNS? In other words, how, for example, sprint training for athletes might benefit a swimmer or a wrestler?
The best part of my presentations when I'm talking about the CNS and how speed's the tide that lifts all boats, and that speed is global. I remember Les Bellman saying that, and I like those terms. Speed is global. So in other words, as you get faster in a straight line, you get a lot better doing everything else. But I totally have stolen Brian's work with his swimmers and with his golfers. And you know, like I could imagine both of those groups saying, but Coach Kula, we don't lift heavy things in our sport. We don't sprint in our sport. We don't jump in our sport. We don't bounce in our sport. But yet that's exactly how he's training these people. And as you become a better athlete, you become a better golfer or swimmer or lacrosse player. So I'll let Brian talk about his stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like Lee said, less talking about it being global. I talk about just like speed can be systemic, right? It can impact the entire system. And so, you know, when we have data collection on swimmers who, when they run, they don't look very good when they run. I promise you that. But the intent of what they're doing and, you know, the coordinative abilities that go into sprinting, there is no activity that you can do that has a higher CNS stimulation than sprinting. And so you see a systemic, you know, improvement. And the swim group that we worked with had 48 club records set after the first year of training with us. And the guy was like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, we're doing the same stuff we do with everybody else. And we kind of stumbled into that and found that, you know, golfers were hitting the ball farther and swimmers were swimming faster and, you know, all that stuff. We're in the midst of a tennis, you know, deal down here in Nashville right now where we're working with the tennis players and trying to show that, you know, through some speed work, we can improve rotational power and acceleration, deceleration work because it's going to impact the CNS.
Yeah, Bush Exnader, about 8 years ago, I listened to a podcast and he had been working with a volleyball team. And there is no sprinting in volleyball. But they asked him, what's the first thing you start working on with that volleyball team? And he said, sprinting. You know, that's what you do. And I think it's so important to recognize that. And then getting back to these football teams that don't sprint. Like in a sport where sprinting really is a part of the sport, And literally they run slow all the time because they're tired all the time. They lift all the time, and the steak is burned every day. And so they never recover. It's an endless spiral downward. But you know, if you have better players than the other team, you're probably still going to win.
That's amen. Jimmy's and Joe's.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So we've got another question here around volume, but I think it does get at a different kind of angle. So the question is regarding sprint training volume, what's your opinion on adding additional reps until performance drops, i.e. one rep is noticeably slower than the ones before it, and calling the session at that point versus prescribing a set volume? And you touched on this a little bit, but I do think that this gets at like the aspect of how you're actually planning your training sessions. Like, you planning a set volume, or are you planning to essentially go until you see that drop off?
So for me, that's the art of coaching. I mean, I think we always prescribe for a certain amount of volume. And I think over the years we found, if we're going to do some accelerations, we're probably in the 3 to 6 range, but that's going to change all the time, based on different factors. Do we see fatigue? Do we see mechanical breakdown? Or did we run really fast? Did we see a PR, right? Like Charlie Francis model would say, if you PR, you're done for the day. I don't care if it was your first rep, because, now you're potentially pushing the envelope for injury and all those things. And so, you got to kind of hold your volume loosely of, program for it to still be a low volume, but be able to maybe even cut from there just based on what you're seeing.
Yeah, and I think really what the questioner was describing was regulation, auto reg, and I've just never done that, because in my experience, 3 timed sprints seem like the sweet spot. Like I said, maybe some freak doesn't run his best one till his 5th one, but that kid knows that. That's why he's wanting to run a 4th and 5th. Whereas some other kid doesn't feel right. He runs one sprint and says, "Coach, I'm done today." I'm good, smart. And so I think we need to be careful. I think really good athletes, I know Brian has worked with so many great athletes that are like this, that are capable of really high capacities of hard work, really high capacity. And what I always warn coaches is, just because they can do it doesn't mean they should do it. Because I think that there's some athletes have a lot of wear and tear. And I would love, if we have time today, to talk about Achilles tendon injuries. I've been thinking about this ever since Halliburton went down the other night. And I just think that a lot of guys have very old tendons. I know that my quadriceps tendon would not have snapped 7 weeks ago if I was 26 instead of 66. So an old tendon will snap more so than a young one. I never see an Achilles snap with a 15 or 16-year-old. I just never see that. But yet we're seeing guys in the NBA who are 26 and 28 snapping those things. And I wonder if we are creating very old tendons because of the 24/7 nature of being a great athlete these days, the number of games that these kids are playing in AAU, along with their high school sports. And all I know, it's a plague right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's cumulative volume, right? It's one
Yes.
thing to have a volume in your training session, but what's your cumulative volume when you started playing basketball at age 8? And to Tony's point, you play in all these games and tournaments and train and all the things. So by the time you're 25 or 26, your tendon age is probably a lot older than your birthday. So cumulative volume is always a thing that we look at too, for especially a group, that we're working with that might have a start and an end point of, how are we going to program for volume from A to B, not just, day to day.
And professional athletes back in the day would actually let themselves get out of shape.
Yep.
And they would get eaten alive.
Yeah.
In today's sports world if a professional athlete came in 15 pounds overweight.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's outliers that do different programming and stuff. And I think just finding the right, keeping them healthy, making sure they're available, that's way more important than trying to, push the envelope with, especially a high level guy or gal.
Love it. Okay, cool. We've got Man, the questions are coming in. We've got 22 piled up here, but we'll try to. So I might start selecting some just so the audience knows. If I see similar questions, I'll kind of try to bundle them into one so that we can get to as much as possible. But the next question is from Drew, and the question is around when doing contrast training, essentially whether or not the movements need to be back to back, right? So Drew asks, does it have to be contrasted, or in one part of your session could it be resisted sprints and then in another portion free sprints later on in the session? And it sounds like more specifically talking about younger developing high school athletes, or is it just based on logistics?
I would think it would be better closer together. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, it is better closer together, but sometimes the logistical, nature of your team or your setup, you can't always be perfect in that. And I think also too, depending on your age group you're working with, you can make mistakes a little bit with, the 12 to 16-year-old age group, right? There are some volumes they can handle differently, versus a pro soccer girl. You can't miss on those. And so you probably want to make sure that those are close in nature and that you're monitoring the volume of that. But, young high school program, ninth graders, could you run all your resisted reps, with one group and then switch them over and run your unresisted reps? Absolutely. I think that you can, I ran high school track program for a long time where we'd kind of station things up. You'd have a station of your sled pulls, you'd have a station of your timed 30s, you have a station of your plyometrics, and we would kind of cycle those. There's still some contrasted PAP effect going on there. Is it ideal and perfect for, an NFL all-pro guy? Probably not, but you can miss on that with a 13, 14-year-old and still get some great adaptation.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. Next question from Sonia is someone who just graduated in strength and conditioning science and got an assistant S&C job in a semi-pro women's soccer team with coaching overhaul. What are some of the non-negotiables you guys have with the athlete if you only have athletes 2 days a week for a very limited time and need to make a maximum impact on speed? First of all, congratulations, Sonia. And I'll let Brian or Tony, whichever one of you guys wants to start with that. So 2 days a week, what are the non-negotiables for speed?
I already know what Tony's going to say, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, with those 2 days, I really believe that if you're working with soccer, you have to resist reverse engineering soccer. That when you're with those soccer players, they do not need a soccer ball. They do not need to be running 7 miles. Let soccer train soccer. Away from soccer, those kids need things they don't get from soccer, which is sprint fast, lift heavy, jump high, jump far, and bounce. So you need to try to attack as many of those things as possible. My atomic speed workout that anybody can just type into Google and they'll see it, is a great hook because there's 15 minutes is all it takes to do it, and you're only doing 60 seconds of work. So not only are you hitting the things that they're not getting in soccer, but you are also not ruining soccer later that day. You're actually there's a potentiation effect when you're doing those type of drills where their soccer practice will actually be better because of the things that you're doing with them.
No further questions.
I was gonna say, anything to add, Brian? Perfect.
No,
Okay.
I think you're looking for your biggest return on investment, right? You have short amount of time. Soccer's, they're bogarting every minute of their week. And so if you have the time and they're recovered enough, that's the only other thing to consider in that question is if they're gassed after 2 days of soccer and you're getting them for 20 minutes, you might be limited in how much speed exposure you can give them. So you got to be careful, in that. And where else can I, maybe carve out some, high performance without getting them injured. So it's a fine line that you're fighting a long-term battle there. But Tony's exactly right. I think you got to expose them to speed and some, strength levels that they're not used to seeing in soccer.
Got it. Awesome. Okay, we've got another broad one here, which is what are your focus and thoughts on the eccentric phase?
Brian?
Maybe
Yeah,
start with that one.
Yeah. Well, I think that just peels back to total development of an athlete. I think eccentric, loading is super important for every sport. As a track and field guy, I didn't work on it a lot with that sport because they didn't need a lot of eccentric, force. But with basketball, football, soccer, I mean, fill in the blank of any other sport that has any level of change direction at all. You better have as strong of a, eccentric system as you do a concentric system, or you're going to get injured. So I think you have to be cognizant of where you're going to place it in your training and make sure that you are attentive to it just as much as you are. I mean, we contrast load some of our eccentric. We'll hook the 1080 up with some assisted broad jumps and let them broad jump into a landing that's actually got a load attached to it, and then take the load off and do the same thing. So we're effectively doing the same thing in an eccentric load as we do when we're going forward.
Yeah, eccentric is really important for deceleration, change of directions. But as a pure sprint coach, you can get by with a lot of concentric stuff. And one of the great things about concentric stuff is that you're not adding any unnecessary soreness to that athlete as well. And that's why concentric and isometric really works well for runners. But yeah, if you're training change of direction athletes, they've got to be eccentric, and all of that stuff will just has to be done.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got two questions here back to back on 800 runners. So we're going to try to bundle them both together. We'll see, because they have some similarities. So the first question is, I have a miler/2 miler who lacks foot speed in the 800. What would you suggest I do with him in the off season to help him improve 800 speed? They also mentioned that they have a T-Apex machine that just came in this week. If that's useful. And then the second question around 800 runner, is there a way to maximize pure speed while also developing speed endurance without compromising one for the other? As a 400/800 meter runner, I've often found that coaches tend to know how to train one or the other, but not both. So there's some overlap between those questions there. And there's probably 10 different places you guys could start on that. But Tony, maybe I'll have you go first.
Well, what I would suggest to have a great 800 guy, first of all, you've got to have a great cross-country program. I don't think there's any way to get a high school teenager to the aerobic point that they need to be a great 800 person. Like I don't think that a fast 400 kid when he's 17 years old does not move up to the 8 very well. But I think that a really good cross-country guy who starts to focus on speed and getting on the track, and I mean, this pisses me off a lot of times, where cross-country coaches want cross-country to be a 12-month-a-year sport. And so during the track season, they're on the roads running. They're running 8-mile runs on Sundays and things like that. Like, hey, coach, this is not cross-country anymore. This is track, and we have to get fast. So the real simple thing that I say is, be in a great cross-country program, be really good at what you do, and then plan on running the 4x4 in every track meet. And if somebody says, well, I only run a 54 in the 4x4, well, you'll never be a good 800 guy run a 54. You better get that 4x4 time down, sub 50 or at least 50 flat or something like that. Now you have a chance to run that 154, which makes you pretty relevant statewide. Now, I know Brian actually trained one of the world's best, right, Brian?
Yeah, I did. Just to quantify it a little bit, I mean, I worked with a gal last year who was 30 years old. She'd been a pro runner for Adidas for almost 10 years. She was an NCAA champion in the mile. And, when she came to me, I didn't really have any interest in trying to meet her where she was at with her programming. I wanted to, I had my own thoughts and ideas around it. And she was a high mileage, probably close to 65, 70 miles a week, not any speed work hardly at all. And she had gotten really stale over the last 4 or 5 years, some injury stuff, some different personal issues, things like that. But she had kind of gotten stuck at about, two flat outdoors. And we took her and we changed her whole fall, and we really added a full speed development day. So just like we would do with our sprinters, we changed some of her hill workouts to be, shorter in nature, but faster. And then we cut her mileage almost in half. And so we came into the indoor season. Now the 800 is a monster, right? There is aerobic capacity, there's lactic threshold. But I still feel like you got to be able to run fast. If you're going to come through and split, 58 seconds, Well, if that's your 100%, then you're never coming back, from that. You may not even finish the race. So you have to have a level of speed to be able to support, the race plan. And so, we got through indoor season and she ran two of her fastest 800 meters of her career indoors. Finished fourth at the US championships and on half the volume. So, it wasn't like I went completely, we can't just ever run. I agree with Tony. You have to have a base, aerobic base for that race. But we definitely implemented speed. So to the guy that asked the question, I would add in a day a week of dedicated speed work. And I'm talking high end fly tens, drilling sequences, wicket runs, things that are actually going to help them become a more proficient sprinter. And then on top of that, you can't forget about your lactic threshold work. And I like to do that where we would get to lactic and then also try to tag some speed on the back end of that. Because that's the hardest thing about the 800s. They have to run fast under extreme fatigue. So, but speed's a component to all those things. And I don't think that, after you have a good base, you have to be a very high mileage, to run an effective 800.
Did she get faster with her max velocity?
Oh, yeah. She went from, trying to recall, I think she started off at about 16.9 miles an hour in the fall. And I think right before we took off for indoor nationals or USA's, she hit 18.4 miles an hour. So she almost, close to 2 miles an hour of improvement in her foot speed.
Did she enjoy training more,
Oh,
or was there pushback?
without question. Without question. And she had some injury stuff going on, and has actually recently, probably since, going to retire, just from, she's been doing it a long time. But I think we got a really great experience for her at the tail end of her career where she loved coming to practice. She had some fun with it. We put her on a mass specific force lifting program, and implemented all the things that I always would have thought would be the right thing to do for an 800-meter runner. Sometimes you don't get a chance to put that in practice, but we did, and it worked really well.
And I love the fact that you were talking about wickets and you probably threw med balls. And
Yep.
I mean, like, it's so many, the cross country programs I do not like. All they do is run and log miles. They don't do anything to improve the athlete. And I think that when you start treating distance runners like athletes first, build that your pyramid on rest, recovery, sleep, and then the athletic qualities that are important in all sports, then you practice cross country specifically. And
Sure.
you can do both, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're still runners, right? They still have to have efficiencies, and some of them are having to run fast at the end of a race, and if they don't know how to do that well or haven't been exposed to it, they're going to suck at it. So, yeah, I believe. I mean, our cross country program, when I was at the school I was at in Denver, we implemented our Bounce Fire series for them on a daily basis as part of their warm up. So we felt like that exposure to that was going to help with some, ankle stiffness and ground strike abilities, and then they take more ground strikes than our sprinters ever took. So to me, it was really important for them to be even more efficient than our sprinters were.
And there's no downside to having a high CNS warm up before an endurance workout.
Right.
No downside, right?
Right. Amen.
Love it. Okay, cool. So there's several questions. And again, to the audience, we were not going to get to all these because you guys have been so engaged. So if I don't hit your question specifically, it's not because I hate you or anything. It's just because I'm trying to bundle stuff together so we can cover as much ground as possible here. Obviously, we'll have to have this duo back on. But there's a lot of questions about loading. And so maybe we can kind of just put them all into one here. So I've seen questions around like what age range is safe to start loading at, specifically how you determine load, how much load, if athletes are generally undertrained, when it's safe to start introducing load. So maybe we can just hit the topic of loading and balancing that with safety generally. Like, how are you guys determining how much load, how many reps loaded, when it's safe, when it's not safe?
I determine most of our loading on body weight percentage, which then kind of helps you like extend the age that you can start it at. Right? Because if a little kid, he's 10 years old, I think there's a preparation phase that you want to kind of introduce them to proper movement first. As long as they're a relatively proficient mover, I think you can start to add some load, and then you just keep it very, very individual to their body weight. I think a really good measure is like 10% of their body weight, which does not change mechanics, is a pretty good place to start. Now that's hard to no, if you don't have the right equipment necessarily. But even if you have a sled and you know how much the sled weighs, then you can, is that kid pulling too much weight? And too much weight that changes mechanics, in my opinion, is a bad thing. There are some very heavy type sled pushes and, some isokinetic type things you can do where it keeps them very slow. Tony Villani does a lot of it with his home run down in Florida. And I think it does teach great acceleration mechanics. And we do some of that stuff. That's higher. That's not even really contrast training at some level. That's like almost like a strength exercise. But I think 10% is a really good place to start for anybody, just to consider you're not changing mechanics. You're not going to overload the system. And I think once they're a decent, proficient mover, you could add some load. Tony?
I have a question about age, Brian, because I've read that I mean, if you have a car that only goes 50 miles an hour, that's a lot different than having a big race car.
Yeah.
Now, with your mass specific force stuff, and that's the concentric deadlifts and the supersetting, followed by really good recovery. At what age would you start a kid? Like a 5-year-old wouldn't do that, right?
No, our baseline bottom end would be like a 9 or 10-year-old. We could start introducing the right movements to them. And we're not going to probably put a bar in their hand. It might be a banded deadlift, and they're going to do a vertical jump without any, depth or apparatus at all. And those things are, I mean, kids jump around on the, we worry about like a depth drop. Go out to a playground and watch kids jump off of jungle gyms. They do it all the time, right? And they're pretty good at it. So I think it's just keeping it, we're not going to introduce a trap bar, to them until they're probably 12, 13 years old. But we're going to do some, banded deadlift. We're going to do some kettlebell deadlift. We'll kind of progress them up in a progression. And then contrast it with a plyometric. Plyometrics don't have to be big, high box drops or your cat jumps, Tony, or, some of those things that are pretty hard on kids' bodies. You can just do a vertical jump, which really was one of, the vertical jump, which turns into a hurdle hop, was Allison Felix's, progression. She ended up being pretty good.
Love it. Okay, cool. I think that this might be a good question to maybe round out with here, if it's the last one we have time for, because I think sometimes, and you guys have addressed this, which I appreciate you doing, but people jump in here throughout and they hear you guys talking about different technologies that you're using. Sometimes that can create the impression that it's like, oh, we got to have a 1080 to do any of this stuff, right? And so I like to end on a question that reinforces that that's not necessarily the case. Tony, you guys don't have a 1080, correct? Am I right about that, or am I wrong about that?
Correct.
Okay.
Chris Korfus was the first American to buy one in 2014. And Peter Holmertz, the CEO, came over, drove 20 miles to my school. And I asked him how much it cost, and he said 20. And I never forget my sprinter, who was doing the 1080, said 20 what? And he said 20,000. And so obviously, not everybody, people that can't buy 1080s have to have rubber bands and other things, or they need to drag a chain or something. And so the only technology that we have, I think you have to be able to time sprints. I think if you're not timing sprints, you're coaching in the dark. And so that's the big one. And there are some really cool wearables now where you put the chip on your wrist and you throw a med ball up into the air, and you know how fast the med ball is going because you know how fast the wrist was going. You can put it on your shoe and do prime times, and you can get ground contacts. And so I think with the record, rank, and publish and data collection and gamifying practice, even those chips that cost like $500 a piece, I don't think you need 30 of them. But I think in X Factor days you could have a couple of those. I think that's something that people actually will be able to afford at the high school level.
Yeah, I think the most valuable technology on the planet is coaching experience and the art of coaching. You could substitute a lot of these things. I mean, the best, if you don't have a lot of money, invest in a couple of the skills, weight bags, and you can do contrast training very similar to what a 1080 does. I mean, that doesn't do 1080 a lot of favors, but it's good enough, and you can get a lot of mileage out of doing that kind of work. And I did it for 3 decades. I mean, I just recently, we got some 1080s that we're playing around with, and it's really fun to have now. But I got along for 30 years doing it without that stuff. I mean, even a hill's great, a way to contrast and add some resistance without changing mechanics, as long as it's not too steep. And, we did that for a long, long time. So I wouldn't be intimidated or deterred from, looking into some of these concepts. You just have to have enough of a art of coaching of how can I, implement that similar concept without that device.
I was going to ask you about hills. I know you're big on hills. Like what type of grade? I used to say that the only hills that I wanted to run up were sprintable hills. Obviously, I don't think climbing a mountainside makes you any
Right.
faster. So
Right.
you want a sprintable hill. And then I know Ernie Clark, who I have a lot of respect for, talked about short sprints up
Yep.
a hill. And
Yep.
but you and I both know that hills are used as torture devices a lot of times, right? Like we're going to run 20 hills.
Yeah.
And so explain what a hill workout would look like for you guys.
Yeah. I mean, everyone tries to find their perfect hill, right? And I think somewhere between like 10 and 20%, grade is a good hill. Obviously, it's a lot like the loading is, if it's too steep for the athlete, then you got to back it down somehow. And so, a treadmill is, that's what I've gotten the fortune of being able to, the Z tread is the best hill in the world, because you can put it on exactly the incline that you want it on and adjust the speed and make it perfect for every athlete. But outside of that, Tony, I think a shorter hill and something that's like a 6 to 8 second kind of a hill is way more effective than just running some long, maybe less of a percentage type of hill. So I'd probably take a steeper one over, but it's still got to be sprintable. You get up over 25%, 30% grade, you're going to completely change mechanics. You've now entered into that too much load on the system, and they're not going to look very good.
I saw a track in Europe that was actually a track that went uphill. And I thought, no, that's my kind of hill, because you spike up and you can really do some damage there.
Yep. Yeah. I've long visioned a facility that's got about an 80-meter, 5-degree incline where you could do, overspeed and resisted running. The treadmill answers a lot of those questions. There's still nothing like putting your foot on the ground and running. So
how many Z treads do you have now?
we'll put 4 in our new facility. We have 2 of them back in Denver. Yeah.
Wow.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome, gents. Well, I want to make sure that we get you guys out of here on time. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. And I mean it when I say we'll have to have you guys back, because, man, we've got 20 unanswered questions in the Q&A. So for anybody's question that we didn't get to, I apologize. Hopefully we touched on something that related to your question. I know we covered a lot of ground, and couldn't be more grateful, Brian, for you and for Tony. And Brian, again, we're super excited to see you out at the summit. And so just to give a little bit more details on that again before we wrap up, we've got our Speed Lab Summit coming up September 19th and 20th, or through 20th, at the C4 Performance Center in Austin, Texas. We're super excited about it. The Speed Lab Summit is just one reason to join the Speed Lab community. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering up with us at the Universal Speed Rating as a Speed Lab partner, of course, we'll send out emails and you can jump on a call with us and learn more about that. But without any further ado, I appreciate you, gentlemen. And either you have any closing thoughts?
No, excited to see everybody in Austin. If you didn't get your question answered, show up down there. We'll round table and get them all answered.
And people could just go down to Franklin, Tennessee as well, right?
Right. That's right. Come see us.
Just pop in unannounced. Yeah. En masse. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
Take care. See you guys. See you, Tony.
Bye-bye.